The hatch slams shut above you. Darkness. Complete darkness. The only sound is water rushing, rising, somewhere beneath your boots. You are inside a German submarine. It is sinking. Right now, you have no radio, no backup. The rescue boat that brought you here was just crushed between two steel hulls. You heard it happen. Somewhere in this flooded compartment, 13 bombs are counting down. You don't know which ones are already armed. You don't know how much time is left. You don't even know where they are. You have a flashlight, a wrench, a pistol that is completely useless right now. Your name is Albert David. You are 42 years old. You are a machine engineer from the United States Navy. And what you find in the next 4 minutes will change the outcome of World War II. Nobody told you it would be this dark. April 9th, 1944. The Atlantic Ocean, 200 miles southwest of the Canary Islands. Captain Daniel Gallery stood on the bridge of USS Guadalcanal and watched a German submarine die. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered, a Notre Dame graduate who had spent his entire adult life in the United States Navy. He understood the mathematics of combat at sea: find the enemy, destroy the enemy, move on. But what he was watching right now was making him sick. The submarine on the surface was U-515. She had been down there for hours, absorbing depth charge after depth charge from Guadalcanal's escort ships. The charges had damaged her diving planes. Her hull was cracked in 3 places. She could not go deeper. She could not stay hidden. At 11:15 in the morning, U-515 broke the surface. Gallery watched his ships open fire immediately. Machine guns raked the conning tower. Rockets crossed the water from aircraft overhead. German sailors scrambled through the hatches, most throwing their hands up and jumping into the Atlantic. The submarine floated. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. Gallery could see the hull clearly from the bridge. He could see the rust lines on the conning tower. He could see the damage from the depth charges. The submarine was right there, floating, accessible. And then, at the 10-minute mark, U-515's bow tilted slowly toward the sky. Her stern pulled her down. She slid backward into the Atlantic, leaving a circle of oil and wreckage and men who were still alive. By every standard that existed, it was a victory. Gallery turned away from the railing and said nothing for a long time. The man they pulled from the water that afternoon was Werner Henke, 35 years old. He had commanded U-515 for 2 years and sunk 25 Allied ships, over 150,000 tons of cargo. In December 1942, he had torpedoed the British troopship Ceramic in a storm. She went down with 656 people aboard. Henke's crew pulled 1 survivor from the water. 1. They left the rest. Now Henke was sitting on an American ship with a blanket around his shoulders, while his submarine was on the bottom of the Atlantic. Gallery looked at him and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction, because Gallery had been doing arithmetic. Inside U-515, somewhere on the ocean floor, were code books, Enigma cipher machines, torpedo guidance manuals, operational orders showing German submarine patrol routes across the entire Atlantic. The Allies had been trying to crack German naval communications for years, and a captured submarine with its Enigma machine and current code books intact would hand them everything at once. Gallery looked at the oil slick where U-515 had been floating 10 minutes ago and understood that he had just watched a war-ending intelligence opportunity sink into the ocean because nobody had been ready to grab it. He did not make that mistake again. The task group returned to Norfolk in late April. Gallery called a meeting. He told his destroyer escort captains what he wanted. He was going to train boarding parties. When the next German submarine surfaced under attack, they were not going to sink it. They were going to take it. The room was quiet. What Gallery was proposing had not been done by the United States Navy since the War of 1812. 129 years. There were no procedures, no training manuals, no equipment designed for the purpose. German submarine crews were trained to scuttle their boats within minutes of surfacing open sea valves, arm demolition charges, destroy code books, smash equipment. The entire process was designed to be completed in under 4 minutes. Even if American sailors could reach a surfaced submarine, they would be boarding a vessel that was simultaneously sinking and rigged with explosives. Every man in that room understood this. Gallery told them to begin training anyway. He did not tell them something else. He had not asked permission from the Navy Department in Washington. He had considered it and decided not to, because he knew what the answer would be. They would say impossible. They would say the risk was too high. They would say no. So Gallery said nothing to Washington. He wrote the plan by hand, held the meetings in private, and ordered every man involved to stay quiet. If it worked, the Navy would forgive him. If it failed, there would be no one to forgive. The man Gallery chose to lead Pillsbury's boarding party was not who anyone would have selected from a list. Albert David was 42 years old, Lieutenant Junior Grade 1 of the lowest officer ranks in the Navy after 25 years of service. He had started as an enlisted sailor at 17 and spent most of his career in machinery spaces, learning how systems worked, how water moved through pipes, how valves failed, and why. He was not a commando. He had never led a combat assault. Gallery chose him because of the pipes and the valves. If David's team could get inside a German submarine before it sank, their first job was not to fight. It was to stop the flooding. That meant finding valves in the dark, in a submarine built by German engineers, in compartments they had studied only from intelligence photographs. David spent 6 weeks learning how to do exactly that. Every day on Pillsbury's fantail, he drilled his 8-man team. They practiced climbing over railings. They practiced jumping from a moving boat onto a moving deck. They memorized the layout of a German-type IXE submarine with their eyes closed, running their hands along mock-up pipe systems until the sequence became automatic. They practiced disarming demolition charges in near darkness. They practiced everything, because once they were inside a sinking submarine in the middle of the Atlantic, there would be no one to ask for help. George Castleman, commanding officer of USS Pillsbury, watched all of this from a careful distance. He was methodical, precise, skeptical of improvisation. He had seen men die from bad decisions made in the heat of combat. He was not convinced Gallery's plan was a good one. But Castleman was a naval officer, and Gallery was his commanding officer. So Castleman prepared Pillsbury for what was coming and said very little about what he privately thought. On May 15, 1944, USS Pillsbury sailed from Norfolk. The official log said routine anti-submarine patrol. In Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz was not thinking about any of this. He was 52 years old, commander of the most feared submarine fleet in history, and he had one absolute conviction: Enigma was unbreakable. His cryptographers had confirmed it. His engineers had guaranteed it. Without the physical machine and the daily cipher settings, German transmissions were meaningless noise to the Allies. He was certain. He had been told to be certain, and no one had yet given him any reason to question it. 3 weeks into Pillsbury's patrol, that was about to change. On the morning of June 4th, 1944, Gallery had ordered a course change toward Casablanca to refuel. The patrol was ending. The waters had been quiet. Nothing. At 11:09, the sonar operator aboard USS Chatelaine reported a contact, bearing 45, range 800 yards, a submarine, running submerged, heading directly toward USS Guadalcanal. On Pillsbury's fantail, Albert David heard the alarm. 6 weeks of training. This was it. Chatelaine turned hard to starboard. 2 FM-2 Wildcat fighters from Guadalcanal were already airborne. They banked toward the coordinates and dove, scanning the surface below for the dark shape of a submarine running just beneath the waves. They found it quickly. Machine gun rounds stitched white lines across the water, marking the position for the ships below, not to destroy, to point. At 11:16, Chatelaine released her first pattern of depth charges, 200 feet below. Inside U-505, the world came apart. Harold Lang had been running silent for hours. He was 37 years old and had taken command of UV-505 8 months earlier, inheriting a submarine that no one in the German Navy wanted. The previous captain, Peter Scheck, had taken his own life at sea on October 24th, 1943, deep beneath the Atlantic. With Allied depth charges falling around him, Scheck had walked to his bunk, placed a pistol against his temple, and pulled the trigger. His crew listened to the shot, and then continued fighting to bring the boat home without him. Lang had stepped into that command. He had taken the broken crew, the cursed reputation. The submarine men whispered about in harbor bars. He had done everything right. He had still ended up here. The first depth charge pattern hit close pressure, not sound, a wall of force, striking the hull from every direction. Simultaneously, light fixtures shattered, pipes cracked. The second pattern hit closer. The lights went out. Emergency red lighting flickered on, casting everything in the color of blood. The diving planes stopped responding. The rudder jammed. Fluting accelerated in the engine room. The third pattern was the one that decided everything. Explosions directly above. The hull flexed. Instruments flew from their mounts. U-505 began rising, despite herself. Diving planes useless. Depth control gone working against gravity in the only direction left. Lang looked at the depth gauge. The needle was moving the wrong way. He gave the order to surface, not because he wanted to, because the boat was going up regardless. And then he gave the second order. Fluten, open the sea valves, arm the demolition charges, destroy everything. The crew moved immediately. This was not a contingency. It was the first response. Sea valves opened in the engine room. 13 demolition charges were primed throughout the boat's compartments. Then U-505 broke the surface. She came up bow first, 700 yards from Chatelaine, her grey hull streaming seawater, her conning tower scarred with rust. She was circling to starboard rudder, jammed, unable to steer. 5 or 6 knots, a wounded animal turning in place. German sailors poured through the hatches. Some reached for the deck gun. Chatelaine and the other escorts answered before they could aim. Machine gun rounds crossed the water from 3 directions. A German sailor fell dead on the deck. The others stopped. One by one, the crew of U-505 went over the side into the cold Atlantic, swimming away as fast as they could. Lang was pulled from the water with wounds in both legs. He looked back at his boat. the boat he had tried to save from its cursed reputation, and watched strangers lower a small vessel toward her hull. On Pillsbury's bridge, Castleman gave the order, "Lower the whaleboat." David was already at the railing. His 8 men dropped into the boat. The coxswain pushed the throttle and aimed at the circling submarine. The sea around U-505 was dark with oil and diesel fuel. German sailors visible in the waves nearby, some waving, some motionless. David kept his eyes on the submarine. The whaleboat cut inside U-505's circling arc. The grey steel loomed larger, 30 yards. 20, 10. They came alongside. The hull was slick, no ladder, no handholds, just riveted steel plates running with water. David grabbed a railing near the base of the conning tower and pulled himself up. His boots found the deck. He stood upright on a German submarine in the middle of the Atlantic and did not stop moving. His men followed him up. The submarine rolled beneath their boots. One German body lay near the conning tower hatch. No other enemy sailors were visible. David found the hatch, pulled it open, and went in. The first thing that hit him was the darkness. Not reduced visibility, complete, absolute darkness. The emergency lighting had failed. He switched on his flashlight and pointed the beam into the compartment below. The light showed water, not a puddle, water covering the control room deck, rising past his ankles the moment he dropped from the ladder. The sea strainer valve, a large pipe assembly, allowing ocean water to enter the boat, had been opened. Its cover had been removed and thrown aside. The flooding was active and accelerating. He sent his men through the compartments and moved toward where the valve cover should be, following the pipe with his hands in the dark, the water rising around his thighs. This is where the training either worked or it didn't. It worked. One of his men found the cover nearby. He screwed it back into place. The flooding slowed, not stopped. The hull had too many cracks for that, but the main inflow dropped from catastrophic to manageable. David breathed once and kept moving. The first demolition charge was in the engine room. Timer running. He pulled the wire connections. The timer stopped. Second charge in the forward torpedo compartment. Third in the control room. Then more machinery spaces, crew quarters, aft torpedo room. Each one located by flashlight in rising water in a submarine still rolling and settling, assessed by men who had never seen German demolition equipment outside of intelligence briefings and disarmed without triggering the mechanism. 13 charges. They found and disarmed all 13. What none of them realized was that the crew's evacuation had been badly executed. The sea valves had been opened, but not all of them. The demolition charges had been armed inconsistently. The code books had been only partially destroyed, and the Enigma machines, the most sensitive equipment on the boat, the technology Germany's entire naval communication security depended upon, were sitting on the chart table in the navigation compartment, untouched. The scuttling had failed. Not because the crew was cowardly. They had surfaced under fire, taken casualties, and their wounded captain was already in the water. The men responsible for specific tasks had panicked or gone over the side without completing their steps. The result, a partially scuttled submarine still afloat, most valuable secrets intact. Above them, U-505 was still circling 5 knots, jammed rudder, fixed arc through the water, and that arc had completed most of a circle. It was carrying her back toward Pillsbury. Castleman saw it and ordered an immediate course change. Too late. The submarine's hull, 1,100 tons at 5 knots, made contact with Pillsbury's starboard side. The whaleboat was between them. Steel against wood against steel. The whaleboat ceased to exist in approximately 1 second. 3 of Pillsbury's compartments flooded. David and his 8 men were still inside U-505. There was no way back. They were completely on their own. At 11:38 minutes after the boarding, Commander Earl Troino arrived from Guadalcanal with a second team. Troino was in his early 40s, built broad through the shoulders. A man who had spent years before the war on merchant ships, learning how marine engineering actually worked outside of textbooks. He came down through the conning tower hatch and found David's men still waist-deep in water, still pulling charges from corners not yet checked. Troino did not celebrate. He assessed. He looked at the flooding rate, the hull condition, the functioning pumps, and Trehindrand began tracing the boat's systems by hand, following pipelines through bilge water, identifying which valves still effered, organizing a damage control effort that would need to be sustained for hours. Slowly, the boat stabilized. Then David's team went back through more carefully. In the navigation compartment, 2 Enigma M4 cipher machines, complete with coding rotors, sitting on the chart table where the navigator had left them. Intact, undamaged, fully operational. Code books next stacked in the cabinet, partially scattered by the depth charge violence. Signal documents, operational orders, cipher settings, patrol zone charts for German submarines across the entire Atlantic. Supply rendezvous coordinates. 900 pounds of classified German naval documents. In the forward torpedo room, 2 Zaunkönig acoustic homing torpedoes. Allied navies had first encountered this weapon in September 1943, when German submarines used them against convoys on S-18 and on 202 with devastating effect. British engineers had since developed the FXR Foxer, a towed noise-making decoy, as an initial countermeasure, but no laboratory had yet examined a complete, fully intact specimen of the weapon itself. Now, American engineers at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington would have too. Gallery received the reports and stood very still on Guadalcanal's bridge. He understood what he had. He also understood what he had to lose. 3,000 American sailors had just witnessed this capture men on the decks of 5 ships, at battle stations, in aircraft overhead, in the water, rescuing German survivors. 3,000 people who knew. If the Germans learned U-505 had been taken intact, not sunk, not on the bottom, but captured with her Enigma machines and code books and secret torpedoes in American hands, they would change everything. Every code book, worthless. Every intercepted message, permanently encrypted. Every advantage gone in an afternoon. Gallery issued his orders. No radio transmissions about the capture. Ship logs would record a routine engagement. Vessel sunk. The 58 German prisoners, including Lang, who had watched his boat boarded from the water, with wounds in both legs, were confined below decks on Guadalcanal. They would speak to no one. No one would speak to them. The Red Cross would not be notified. The prisoners would not be registered. Families in Germany, waiting for the next letter, would receive nothing except in the weeks following a notification that their sailor was missing, presumed lost at sea, presumed dead. Gallery knew what that meant for 58 families. He gave the order anyway, because 2 days later, 48 hours after U-505 was taken, the largest military operation in human history would begin on the beaches of Normandy. June 6th, 1944. 150,000 soldiers hitting 5 beaches in a single morning. The entire Western Allied strategy for ending the war concentrated into one day, one tide, one moment that had been planned for 2 years and could not be replanned if it failed. everything coordinated using intelligence derived from Allied ability to read German communications. If Dönitz changed his Enigma settings, now, if the Germans discovered their codes were compromised at this exact moment, the Allies would go blind at the worst possible time in the worst possible way. Washington received Gallery's message and sent back one word: Bermuda, not Casablanca, not Norfolk, a closed naval facility in the middle of the Atlantic, far from civilian eyes, where a submarine could be hidden and studied without anyone outside a controlled list knowing she existed. Pillsbury attempted the tow. The collision damage had flooded 3 of her compartments. Too much strain. She released. Guadalcanal herself rigged a tow line, a carrier hauling a crippled submarine across half the Atlantic, while USS Abnaki eventually took over the duties. Troino's teams remained aboard U-505 around the clock, pumping, patching, keeping the boat alive hour by hour. The storms hit on the 4th day. Atlantic swells built to 15 feet. The submarine waterlogged, partially flooded. No power of her own moved in ways of vessels was never designed to move. Water came over the deck and into compartments that had taken days to dry. Troino's men pumped and patched and pumped again. The German prisoners in Guadalcanal's brig experienced the same storms, with no understanding of whether the submarine they had served still floated, or whether they would ever see Germany again. They would not for 3 years. On June 19th, 944, 15 days after the capture, the task group entered Port Royal Bay, Bermuda. U-505 was repainted immediately. German markings covered, identification numbers changed, hull color altered to American naval gray. She was given a new designation, USS Nemo. She did not exist. The 58 prisoners were transferred to a classified detention facility in Ruston, Louisiana, not registered with the Red Cross, not listed in any POW database. Families received notifications in the weeks following: missing, presumed dead. Mothers and wives wore black. Children grew up without fathers. All 58 of them were alive in Louisiana. Not one of them could say so. At Bletchley Park and at American Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Washington, the captured materials arrived under maximum security. The Enigma M4 machines confirmed and extended what Allied cryptanalysts had spent years assembling. The codebooks provided cipher settings valid through the summer of 1944. Months of intercepted German transmissions, stored as meaningless encrypted text, suddenly became readable. Submarine positions appeared on Allied charts. Patrol routes became predictable. Rendezvous coordinates for German supply submarines were known before the submarines arrived. Convoy routing officers made decisions they could not explain to the captains whose ships they were saving, because the source could never be revealed even to the men whose lives depended on it. The 2 Zaunkönig torpedoes were disassembled at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory in Washington. Engineers mapped the precise frequency range, the weapon used to track propeller cavitation, the minimum signal strength required to trigger terminal homing, the exact acoustic signature that activated the guidance system. Armed with those specifications, they refined the existing FXR Foxer countermeasures with a precision that had not been possible from fragmentary evidence alone. German submarine commanders noticed the results within weeks. Acoustic torpedoes that had been striking Allied escorts with lethal consistency began missing with alarming frequency. They reported failures to headquarters. They requested investigations. Dönitz concluded the Allies had somehow improved their countermeasures, perhaps from a torpedo recovered, unexploded from shallow water, a partial solution, he assumed. He never considered the complete one. He never asked what had actually happened to U-505. He already knew she had transmitted her last position report on June 3rd and gone silent. Submarines went silent all the time in 1944. She had been lost. Her crew was dead. The boat was on the bottom. He had no reason to question this, so he questioned nothing. Throughout the summer of 1944, throughout the fall, throughout the months, when Allied armies were advancing across France and the German army retreating toward its own borders, Dönitz continued issuing orders in a code that had already been broken. He continued transmitting submarine positions that the Allies were reading in real time. He continued trusting a system that 8 men with flashlights and wrenches had cracked open in the middle of the Atlantic. 3,000 American sailors carried that knowledge in silence for 14 months, from the June 1944 until the story was publicly revealed during the war bond drive of late summer 1945. No formal secrecy oath, no signed documents. Gallery had explained the stakes during the voyage to Bermuda, and the men had listened. Then they had written no letters describing what they had seen, kept no diaries that mentioned the capture. When they returned to port and saw their families, they said the patrol had been routine. Nothing unusual. They carried it alone, every single one of them. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over by late 1944. But in Berlin, in the last months of a dying war, the German Navy was planning one final operation. It would kill 115 American sailors, and USS Pillsbury would be there to answer for it. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing in every direction. Allied armies had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. Hitler had retreated to his bunker. The German army was surrendering in pieces, but the U-boat fleet was still operating. 7 German submarines, Type Ix long-range boats, had been sent west in late March and early April, heading for American waters on what German Naval Command described as a final conventional attack. Allied intelligence detected them crossing the Atlantic and immediately escalated to the highest levels, because what could not be confirmed was what they were carrying. For months, rumors had circulated about German plans to launch V-1 flying bombs or V-2 rockets from submarine platforms. The V weapons had already killed thousands of British civilians. A single V-2 striking Manhattan or Washington in the final weeks of the war, when victory seemed so close, would be psychologically catastrophic. The Navy could not confirm the threat. They could not rule it out. They assembled 2 barrier forces across the Western Atlantic approaches: escort carriers, destroyer escorts, long-range patrol, aircraft, a net of ships stretched across the sea lanes the German submarines would have to cross. USS Pillsbury was assigned to the screen. Operation Teardrop. For 2 weeks, the barrier forces patrolled in shifting fog and heavy April seas. Aircraft flew constant searches. Sonar operators sat at their equipment for hours, listening with the concentration of men who know that what they're listening for has already killed people they knew. The submarines were out there, running silent, running deep, coming west. On April 15th, destroyer escorts located U-1235, and the following day, U-880, both attacked. Both sank. 6 days after that, aircraft and surface ships destroyed. U-518. 3 down. 4 still running. On the morning of April 24th, 1945, USS Frederick C. Davis was on station 650 miles northwest of the Azores, a destroyer escort like Pillsbury, small and fast. Her crew experienced, her equipment current. She was doing exactly what she had been built to do. At 8:29, her sonar operator reported contact, range 2,000 yards, a submarine attempting to slip through the barrier. Frederick C. Davis maneuvered to attack. The contact was strong. The range was closing. The sonar operator called out bearings and distances in a steady, professional voice. Then the contact faded, lost in the ship's own wake as she turned. The officer of the deck ordered a hard maneuver to relocate. The ship swung. The sonar operator swept through the search pattern. The contact came back closer now, much closer, 650 yards. The submarine had been running directly toward them while they were turning. And now, at 8:39, the torpedo struck Frederick C. Davis on her port side. The Zaunkönig, fired by U-546 under Captain Lieutenant Paul Just, 31 years old, who had maneuvered his submarine through the barrier undetected and fired at near point-blank range. The torpedo found the propeller noise exactly as its designers had intended. The explosion detonated in her forward engine room. It did not sink her slowly. The explosion broke the ship in half. Her bow section went down immediately. Her stern floated for 5 minutes, long enough for some men to reach the water, not enough for most. 115 men died. 77 were rescued. Frederick C. Davis was the last American warship sunk by enemy action in the Atlantic theater of World War II. USS Pillsbury was 12 miles away when the distress call came. Castleman ordered flank speed. Within an hour, 8 destroyer escorts had converged on the position. The hunt lasted 10 hours. U-546 dove to 600 feet near the limit of her structural tolerance and ran silent on electric motors, using thermal layers and current and every evasion technique developed over 5 years of war. Pillsbury worked the perimeter. Flaherty coordinated the attacks. Shetland, Varian, Hubbard, Jansen, and Keith joined the pursuit. Depth charges in overlapping patterns. Hedgehog salvos at suspected positions. Each attack forced U-546 deeper, pushed her harder, wore down her batteries and her crew's endurance. The submarine refused to surface. The afternoon passed. The sun began descending. The men on the destroyer escorts drank coffee, rotated at their stations, and did not stop. At 7:43 in the evening, more than 10 hours after Frederick C. Davis went down, U-546 blew her ballast tanks and broke the surface. The destroyer escorts opened fire before she had fully emerged. U-546's crew launched 2 final torpedoes at Flaherty as the submarine surfaced. Both missed. Machine gun fire swept the deck. The German crew went over the side. 33 survivors were pulled from the water. Paul Just was among them. He was taken to the escort carrier Bogue for interrogation. The Navy had one question, the question that had driven Operation Teardrop from the beginning, the question for which there was currently no confirmed answer. Were any submarines carrying V weapons? Just answered. There were no V weapons aboard any of the German submarines crossing the Atlantic. There never had been. The concept had never progressed beyond theoretical planning. The technical obstacles were too large, the submarines not equipped for it. The mission was a conventional torpedo attack, the last thing the German Navy could still attempt. The final gesture of a force that had lost the war and knew it, but had not yet been told to stop. The feared assault on New York and Washington was a ghost. 5 of the 7 submarines had been destroyed. The remaining 2 surrendered when Germany capitulated on May 8th, 1945. 115 American sailors were dead, killed by a weapon whose complete internal workings Allied engineers had only recently mapped with precision, using intact specimens recovered from a submarine captured 11 months earlier. The refined countermeasures were already protecting other ships on that same ocean on that same day. They had not reached Frederick C. Davis in time. Castleman stood on Pillsbury's bridge as the task group assembled. He was older than he had been when this started. They all were. The Atlantic had a way of doing that. He looked out at the water where Frederick C. Davis had been. The ocean looked the same as it always did. Pillsbury turned north. The war in the Atlantic was over. Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. In Ruston, Louisiana, 58 German sailors who had been officially dead for 11 months were told they could write letters home. They sat down to write to wives and mothers and children who had been wearing black for almost a year. They had to explain, in whatever words they could find, that they were alive, that they had been alive the entire time, that the notification of death had been a deliberate lie maintained by governments for reasons that had seemed necessary. There is no simple way to tell someone you have let them grieve for something that did not happen. Harold Lang was among them. He spent 11 months in Louisiana with 2 poorly healed wounds in his legs and the knowledge that U-505 was in American hands, being examined by people who would use what they found to complete the destruction of everything he had served. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He lived until 1967. He never fully explained, in anything that survives in the historical record, what those 11 months were like. Some things are carried privately and set down quietly at the end, with no ceremony and no audience. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King reviewed the full accounting of what Gallery's task group had accomplished and arrived at a conclusion containing 2 contradictory truths simultaneously. The intelligence value had been extraordinary. The Enigma machines and code books allowed Allied codebreakers to read German naval communications during the critical summer of 1944, when the Normandy invasion hung in the balance, and every piece of operational intelligence was being converted directly into decisions about who lived and who died. The detailed examination of U-505's Zaunkönig torpedoes gave engineers the precision to improve countermeasures against one of Germany's most effective weapons. The patrol zone charts revealed submarine concentrations that allowed convoy routing officers to move ships around danger without telling the captains why they were changing course. Then King summoned Gallery privately. Gallery had planned and executed a major intelligence operation without authorization. He had taken a risk with Allied communications security that, if the Germans had learned about the capture before D-Day, could have altered the outcome of the Normandy invasion. King was not a man who used praise as a substitute for accountability. Gallery received the Legion of Merit. He also received a private understanding that his career would not advance in the ways a man of his ability might otherwise have expected. Gallery had been right. That was not the same thing as having been authorized. He accepted both. He was eventually promoted to Rear Admiral. He wrote a book about U-505 after the war, because some stories are too large to keep entirely private, and because the men who served in his task group deserved to have their story told eventually. He lived until 1977. The Medal of Honor that Albert David had earned was presented at a White House ceremony on October 9th, 1945. Harry Truman held the medal, the five-pointed star on its pale blue ribbon, the highest honor the United States government can bestow. Awarded in the entire Atlantic theater of World War II to exactly one sailor, for exactly one action, on exactly one morning, in June 1944. The man who earned it was not in the room. Albert David had died of a heart attack on September 17th, 1945. He was 43 years old. He had survived boarding a German submarine under fire, survived disarming 13 demolition charges in complete darkness in rising water, survived the collision that destroyed his rescue boat and left him isolated on a vessel barely staying afloat, survived the voyage to Bermuda and 14 months of enforced silence and the slow public revelation of what he had done. He had not survived the peace. 3 weeks before the ceremony, 3 weeks, Truman placed the medal in the hands of Linda May David, Albert's widow. What she was carrying when she accepted it, what it meant to hold the proof of what your husband had done after the government had finally allowed itself to say, so that is not recorded anywhere. She accepted the medal. She brought it home. The Navy honored David's memory by commissioning a destroyer escort in his name in 1968. The ship served for decades. It went to the breakers eventually. The name remained. USS Pillsbury served until 1947, returned in 1955 as a Cold War radar picket ship hunting Soviet submarines on the same ocean, then was decommissioned again in 1960 and sold for scrap in 1966. No museum displays her. No monument marks what she accomplished. The ship that participated in the only American submarine capture since 1815 exists now only in photographs and official records. What the ocean takes, it keeps. U-505 was a different matter. After Germany surrendered, the Navy's plan was to tow her offshore and sink her gunnery practice, a target, the same end as hundreds of her sister ships. Gallery had other ideas. He had not risked a court-martial and 3,000 men's silence for 14 months to watch U-505 become a gunnery target. He contacted civic leaders in Chicago, his hometown, and proposed that the submarine be transported to the city and placed on permanent display. The Museum of Science and Industry agreed. The engineering problem was considerable. 750 tons, moving from the Atlantic coast through the Gulf of Mexico, up the Mississippi River system, and finally across Chicago streets on specially constructed rollers. Thousands of people lined the route to watch a German submarine move through their neighborhoods at the speed of a slow walk. Some of them had lost people in the Atlantic. Some simply stood on the curb because something in the sight of it, the grey hull, the conning tower, the sheer physical fact of the vessel made real what the war had actually been in a way that newspapers and radio never quite had. On September 25th, 1954, Fleet Admiral William Halsey dedicated U-505 as a permanent war memorial. In 2004, she was moved indoors into a climate-controlled underground exhibit hall. She is there now. Walk through the conning tower hatch and you are in the control room where Albert David searched in the dark for demolition charges with water rising around his boots. The valve that Troino closed to slow the flooding is still there. The chart table where the Enigma machines were found is still there. The compartments where 8 American sailors worked against time and darkness and a rising ocean to preserve something that would change the course of the war, preserved almost exactly as they were on the morning of June 4th, 1944. The Medal of Honor David never lived to receive is displayed alongside the submarine. The 2 Enigma M4 machines his team found on the chart table are there. The acoustic torpedoes, the 900 pounds of classified material that 3,000 sailors carried in silence for 14 months. All of it behind glass in a room underground in Chicago, where the air never changes. More than 30 million people have visited since 1954. The capture of U-505 remains the only time the United States Navy has boarded and seized an enemy warship at sea since the War of 1812. It has never happened again. Karl Dönitz went to Nuremberg, was convicted, and served 10 years in prison. He was released in 1956. He wrote his memoirs. He lived until 1980, died at 89 years old. In those memoirs, he described the collapse of the German submarine campaign, the mounting losses, the Allied countermeasures that always seemed to be one step ahead. He attributed it to Allied technological superiority, air power, radar, the overwhelming weight of American industrial production. He never mentioned U-505 because he never knew, not during the war, not during his trial, not during the decade he spent in prison reviewing his decisions and their consequences, not in the memoir he wrote afterward, trying to explain to history and perhaps to himself how the weapon he had built had failed. The U-boat commander who had come closest to winning the Battle of the Atlantic died without ever knowing that a single submarine, captured intact by 8 men, with flashlights and wrenches on a morning in June 1944, had handed his enemies a master key to his operations. At the moment it mattered most. He went to his grave believing Enigma had been impenetrable. He went to his grave wrong. In the end, this is what the story of U-505 comes down to. Not the hardware, not the cipher machines, or the code books, or the acoustic torpedoes, though those mattered enormously. Not the intelligence value, or the operational advantage, or the careful strategic accounting of ships saved and submarines found and convoys safely routed. It comes down to a 42-year-old machine engineer who understood pipes and valves, who had spent 25 years learning things that nobody thought were going to matter in the way they mattered on that one particular morning, who dropped through a hatch into complete darkness with water rising around his boots and 13 bombs somewhere in the compartments below him, and worked until the job was done. He never received the medal they gave him. He never walked through the exhibit that his actions made possible. He never knew that 30 million people would eventually stand in the spaces where he had worked. There is a version of this story where Albert David is a hero, where Gallery is a visionary, where the whole operation is a triumph of American courage and Navy training and the kind of determination that gets monuments built and medals awarded and books written. That version is not wrong, but it is not the whole story. The whole story includes 58 families in Germany who wore black for nearly a year, for men who were alive in Louisiana and who would not learn the full truth until 1947. It includes a direct Rachvan of the Geneva Convention, authorized at the highest levels of American naval command, because the alternative was unacceptable and the war did not wait for clean choices. It includes 115 men on USS Frederick C. Davis, who died on April 24th, 1945, in the final weeks of a war already decided, from a weapon whose workings American engineers had only just fully mapped, using specimens from a submarine captured 11 months before. It includes the question of whether the intelligence gained was worth what it cost, not in money, not in operational risk, but in the human cost of letting families grieve, for men who were still alive, of choosing deception as a weapon and living with what deception does to the people it touches. History does not resolve this question. History simply records that it happened. 3,000 American sailors stood on the decks of 5 ships in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean on June 4th, 1944, and watched something that no American naval force had accomplished in 129 years. They went home. They saw their families. They sat at dinner tables and answered questions about the patrol. Fine, they said. Routine. Nothing unusual. They were asked to do their jobs, and then to say nothing about it. They did both. That is the story of U-505. That is the story of what the ocean gives up when the right men are ready to reach for it, and of what it costs